Hello everyone, this is the recording for topic 3 and this topic focuses on the requirements of teaching what we have learned last week about variation to students of Key Stage 1 and 2. So it is expected that by the end of this lesson you will be able to explain what are the statutory requirements for pupils to know at Key Stage 1 and 2, and secondly to suggest ways of teaching variations and diversity at Key Stage 1 and 2. Before we go on and talk about what to teach to the students of Key Stage 1 and 2, it is of utmost importance that you are clear of what diversity is and the need to classify things so that later you can communicate this to your students. So why do we need to actually classify things? Now you have to help your students in understanding the core concept of classification, that there are common threads that connect all living things and non-living things. This helps men in classifying them. So can you recall how many groups of animals are there that you have learned? Yes, so if you remember during the last lecture that I had with you, I actually get you to give examples of classification, and it's not necessarily classifying animals into amphibians, fish, that 5 groups, okay? It can be only vertebrates and invertebrates. So you have to make this clear to your students, and the need to classify things is because we can find common threads among the living things and non-living things. So in this slide, the essential takeaway here would mean the main point that can lead to key inquiry questions for students of Key Stage 1 and 2. Now, the three essential takeaway that can lead to key inquiry questions is firstly, that your students need to know that there is a great variety of living and non-living things around us. You can ask questions such as, what can we find around us? To your students, okay? Secondly is that man can classify living and non-living things based on their similarity and differences to better understand them. Here, you can ask questions like, how can we classify the great variety of living and non-living things? And get them to question themselves and look for the similarities and differences. Thirdly, based on the third point, you can actually ask them, what is it important to maintain diversity? And we want them to know that maintaining diversity of living things around us ensure that this diversity of living things can continue surviving. So these 3 points here are essential for students to understand if they're engaging and learning about diversity. Alright, so you make sure that you know all these 3 essential takeaways. And let's move on to the next slide. So under Key Stage 1, it is important that students should at least know that living things can be grouped in a variety of ways. They can learn to group animals, either perhaps into hairy or non-hairy. So this is an example of binary classification. It is not necessary that they can group animals into the 5 groups, namely fish, amphibian, mammals, reptiles, and birds that I have mentioned earlier. Or they can even classify plants into flowering and non-flowering plants, or colorful petals, or plants with only white petals. Okay, so these are perhaps a few examples that I can give you here. Now, to get students to demonstrate this kind of understanding, the activity in the classroom can be various. For example, you get the students to look up for the differences and similarities between them and their classmates, so they can group themselves in terms of, let's say, gender, the month of birth, their shoe sizes, etc., etc. Okay, so based on this slide, we are going to do one activity that I need you to submit to me at the end of this so-called lecture. I would like you to develop one lesson plan which tells me how would you plan for one lesson that teaches students at Key Stage 1 on grouping animals or plants according to their observable feature. Now, when I say animals or plants, it doesn't mean you have to do both. Okay, you have to choose only one, either grouping animals or grouping plant, So you can see, if you look at the slide, it's under point number 2, sub point 2 and 3. Okay, you choose either one, either animal or plant, and submit this lesson plan by the end of today to record your participation in this class. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now let us continue to teaching diversity at Key Stage 2. The idea of teaching diversity in Key Stage 2 here is more sophisticated, where students need to recognize that living things produce offspring of the same kind, but normally they are not identical to their parents. So instead of looking at just them and themselves, they have to also look at their parents, which is one level higher, and look at what are the criteria or features that were inherited to them or their sisters. And it is not necessary that it's only applicable to them. It can also be to plants or to perhaps animals. Okay, hence here it is straightforward that students' activity in class must try and incorporate recognizing the features inherited from their parent. This can be illustrated by getting students to look at the examples of a breed of an animal like cats or dogs, and let them recognize that the puppies of kitten or kittens must follow either their mom or their dad. It's never the case that it takes up both the identical mixture of their mom and dad's feature. Alright, so these are the examples of activity which I've put up in point number 2. You don't have to do a lesson plan on this, just Key Stage 1 will be enough at this point. Alright, so moving on, I'm going to tell you or highlight what misconception is in science, in learning science, to be more exact. Misconception can be defined as concept perceived by children which is different from that of scientists. Okay, I repeat, the concept that is different from that of scientists is known as misconception. This is particularly important for us to be aware of because it is common for students to have misconception when science is involved. We know that science is about living or studying things around us, the living things and non-living things around us, our environment. And because of this, students can grow up looking and making sense of things around them. And we know that TVs and cartoons that they watch sometimes can impart this kind of misconception. Now let's take an example from the animation movie released in 1998. Okay, it's called A Bug's Life. I hope you have all watched this. Now there is one part of this movie which can show us the example of misconception. There's one part where the caterpillar transforms straight to butterfly just by developing another 2 wings on his back. If you have never seen the movie before, you can see the snippet of the movie on the YouTube link which I've put out on the slide. Now you have to remember that misconception must be checked before you introduce a new concept in a lesson. If you put it in the context of A Bug's Life earlier, students might just perceive that caterpillar don't have to transform into something really different. It just adds up to wing and you call it butterfly. If you are teaching metamorphosis or even about butterfly in your class, you have to be aware that the students might be holding this kind of misconception. Okay? Hence, again, I would like to emphasize that you have to remember that misconception must be checked before you introduce a new concept in your lesson. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you invite your friends over to your house and they do not know where your house is. So they call you up, they ring you up and ask for directions to your house. What will be the first thing that you will do? Well, it is obvious that the first thing that you will do is to ask your friend where they are. Only from there you will know how to guide them to where they want to go, correct? So it is the same thing with conception. You need to know if your students are having misconception. You need to know their status of their conception. You need to know what they have perceived before you can teach them a new concept. Or else, they will end up learning the new concept with misconception as the foundation of it. And this is not promoting scientific literacy, which is the aim of science education. Putting it into context, putting misconception into the context of diversity, there are common conceptions, or rather misconceptions, that children hold. I'm going to share with you two common misconceptions of diversity here so that you are aware of this misconception and you can diagnose this to see whether your children or your students have this. Firstly, many children tend to see that there are only three creatures on the planet, which are plants, animals, and human. Now we know that this is wrong because human is not a category on its own. We only have plants, animals as living things. You have to clarify to them that human are categorized as animals. So by looking at the similarity of us perhaps and other primates like apes, then they may accept that they they are somewhat categorized under animal and not human exclusively. Secondly, students tend to only notice similarity but not difference. This is a finding from a lot of research. Okay, so teach them. When you teach diversity, teach them to see similarities and get them to identify what are the differences between the similarity. For example, you should encourage them to know that we all have tongue. So this is one similarity. However, in this similarity, one person might be able to roll his or her tongue and another person might not because it's not inherited from the parents. I'm sorry, because they are not, that is a feature inherited from the parents for not rolling the tongue. I'm sorry. Okay, so the conclusion is core idea of teaching diversity to students is to let them understand that variation is a part of their life. And again, misconception have to be diagnosed before you teach the new concepts in the classroom. Okay, so this is the lecture for topic 3. I hope to see your lesson plan submitted this week, and please tell me if you have any questions.